All right, fantastic. Thank you very much, Senator, again for joining us. And I figured I'll start out kind of where you left off, if you don't mind. You talked about a lot about national security and defense. Just want to pivot quickly to the VA and to that system. As you've seen in the Senate, billions more spent every year. The New York Times last month, and again, consider the source, but on this one, I think it's about right. The New York Times last month said that wait times have doubled since more has been spent. What do you believe is the single greatest reform or set of reforms that would be needed to actually transform the veterans' health care system into a quality health care system?
I've seen the VA up close. I worked at the Durham VA, I worked at the Asheville VA, and I also worked at the Fayetteville VA, all in North Carolina. And even when I was there 25 years ago, there were lines and long waits. In fact, I tell the story in my book of how I used to try to outfox the VA to get things to work better. When I was a medical student, you would see one patient, you'd work them up, and then you got to go home. You didn't spend the night in the hospital. So that's an incentive to try to get it done at a reasonable hour so you can get home. So I kept seeing my veteran come up, and my veteran would get up at the floor at like 10 o'clock at night, and I'll say, oh, when did you get here? And they'd say, oh, no, I've been here since noon. And I was like, man, I think we can do better than that. So I started going down before they got checked in. I'd meet the veterans. I'd take their history. I'd draw their blood. I'd get their x-ray, their EKG before they got checked in. I'd have them done when they got their bracelet. And I'd also research their disease, all of this before they were checked in. And as soon as they got their bracelet, I was finished because I did the work in advance. But what we have to realize about the VA, and I think the care is for the most part good. I think most of the veterans I saw actually felt like the quality was pretty good of the care, and most veterans I talk to, they don't want to like get rid of all the VA hospitals. But I think you have to realize that the VA hospital system, the way the goods are distributed, is a single payer system. It is like Canada or England, and the way healthcare is rationed is through waiting. And so it's not very efficient and never will be. So what we ought to do is if we decide we want VA hospitals, let's keep them for some of the specialized things, for burns, unfortunately for amputations, post-traumatic stress disorder, and some veterans' needs. But I think for routine care, you know, if you live an hour and a half from the VA and you're 55 years old and need a routine colonoscopy, you ought to just be able to get it in your local town. So I have voted for vouchers to put people outside of them and realize that when we build these VAs, man, it's like everything else in government does. They really mess it up. They're building one in Aurora, Colorado for $1.8 billion, 180 beds, $9 million per bed. I mean, that's just insane. You could buy everybody in the whole country private health insurance for what it's costing to build one hospital. So I'm not saying eliminate what we have. I'd say you can keep it, keep some specialty hospitals, but I'd also have the transition and see if we can save some money and help with the convenience of veterans and let them have a choice to go into private care.
Absolutely. Doctor, you know, we asked that question of veterans across the country, did nationwide polling. 90% of veterans simply want that choice, want that option. You've only been in Washington a short time, but you've been in the middle of a lot of tough discussions and debates. Why don't you think it changes? Why do you think Washington reflexively goes back to more spending and more dollars? Are there things inherent in the system that are blocking reform from being possible? If veterans want it, right, why is the response always just more dollars as opposed to something like you outlined?
It's inertia and status quo, and they do the same thing for everything. Like same way with education, we think, well, we'll get better education if we spend more federal dollars. The cities that spend more per pupil actually have the worst education. So Baltimore, Washington, New York spend the most per pupil and have the worst. It's the same way with the VA and with Veterans Affairs. Let's just throw more money at it because the veterans are a constituency and they'll think that we like them and are treating them well if we put more money in. But really what you need are market forces. Market forces bring prices down, and so there has to be a way to control costs. And you think it's bad now? We've sent millions of kids over the last decade to war, and now there's a lot of them that are retiring and are going to need health care for a long time. And we've got to figure out a better way of doing this. And but you need to bring market forces into it, and we have to figure out a way that isn't a completely single-payer government system.
Mm-hmm. Shameless plug, if I will, Senator, while you have you sitting here amongst friends. That's what our report attempts to do effectively, is give that veteran a choice while preserving the system as it exists. So those that want to choose it can choose it, and especially in specialized care. But for general options and others, why can't they use that common sense? And we mentioned the choice card and usage of the choice card. Do you have any thoughts on the choice card and what you've seen? No need to go on a long time about it, but.
Well, I voted for it because it sounded good, like we would give veterans a choice. One of the problems there, government can't do anything. That's the problem. They try to start this, and they can't even get people signed up for it properly, and they make it too complicated, so very few people have even signed up for it is one problem. The other problem is they tell me that if there's any clinic within 40 miles, you don't get the choice card. But let's say the clinic is for dialysis and you have a heart problem.
Sure.
So the dialysis clinic that's within 20 miles of you isn't helping you at all, but the heart place is an hour and a half. Your choice card should work so you can go see a cardiologist in your town. But it's not because they say the dialysis center is within 40 miles. So it's just like everything else government does. They have a very difficult time getting something new started.
Absolutely, very customer friendly in that scenario. I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and then I've got questions coming up to me from the audience as well. You talked a little bit about defense spending and reform. The bulk of the equipment the U.S. military is using was built or designed during the Reagan defense buildup. You mentioned the Humvees. I agree. And actually, they can have a few of the ones that we had. They broke down so often. So I'll just leave it there. Why do you think that almost every major weapons program has either been massively over budget or behind schedule, canceled outright? And what DoD reforms could help ensure the best weapons reach the right hands at the right time?
You know, where do you start on this? I mean, some of these weapons, we develop them, they're going to be extraordinarily expensive, and we say we're going to build, 10,000 planes. Then we get halfway through and say, oh, we built the wrong plane, and we're only going to do 5,000 of them, so now their price goes up and doubles and triples because we're only doing half as many. I think that when we look at building systems, there needs to be some incentives. So one of the things that I've proposed for all government employees is that we should give bonuses to them based on finding savings. So if you're in the Department of Education, or let's say Department of Energy, and you have a $12 million budget, and if you'll save the taxpayer $1 million, give them a raise. Mm-hmm. Give them $10,000 raise if they'll save us $1 million. Put market incentives into government. You could do the same for defense contractors. So let's say I'm building a new fighter jet, and it's a $10 billion contract. It's an enormous contract. There's no incentive for me when it's cost plus in order to save money. But let's say I get into it and you're one of my engineers and you come up with a way we can save $10 billion or $1 billion. Well, what we ought to do is give the defense contractor a portion of the savings. So what we usually do is we set their profit as $50 million and that's it. So it doesn't matter if they spend $10 billion or $20 billion, they still get the $50 million. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they have penalties, but let's also have incentives to save. So their $50 million profit might become $75 million if they'll save the taxpayer, $1 billion or something like that.
Absolutely. Do you have Dan bring the? One last question, and then we'll get to the ones we've got here from the audience. I asked this last time as well. What grade would you give President Obama on his handling of both? I'll ask for 2 grades. One, handling of veterans and Department of Veterans Affairs issues, because he's made that a rhetorical priority. And number 2, what grade would you give him on national security and defense matters?
Is the lowest F? I think, one, I think his foreign policy has been wrong, but 2, I don't think he has a great deal of appreciation for what it really takes to defend the country. And so I think on every front, he's let us down.
All right, I'm going to read these off so we get them right, but I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if I mention your name. Sharon Erickson, where are you at, Sharon? There we go. This is a question from Sharon. Recent reports have a VA budget millions in the hole, billions in the hole. About $2.5 billion in the hole. Yet employees continue to receive bonuses while they talk about closing hospitals. Do you feel they should put the money in care in hospitals and not into the administration at the top?
Well, the problem is like a lot of things in government, you can't fire anybody. Do you know when they were falsifying the waiting times and saying the waiting times were much shorter than they were and people were actually dying while waiting to get care? The people who lied about it still may be at the VA. We passed a law, when we passed the Choice Act, we actually wrote a provision in there saying, now you'll be allowed to fire people. But this is a problem with government. There isn't this excellence in government that you ought to have, because you can't fire people because there are all these rules, all these union rules about firing people. I'll give you an example. 9/11, terrible tragedy for our country. No federal employee was ever fired. The FBI, the agent that found the 20th hijacker, that guy named Moussaoui, he wrote 70 letters to his superior saying, we ought to look at this guy's computer. His superior never did anything about it. Should have been let go. I mean, fired, never in a position of authority again. Same with the VA. We've got to be able to fire the people that are not doing a good job and replace them. Where you put the proceeds, whether it's in, obviously you don't want to put it into the bureaucratic middle ground. You'd rather have it in the caregivers. And there are some great tragedies that we've got going on. Post-traumatic stress and suicide is one of the biggest problems. In many of the statistics, more people are dying from suicide than combat right now. So it's a real problem. And so we need psychiatric care, mental health care, and people need not to be waiting in line for a month to get in.
Absolutely. Next question, Will Wetzel. Where are you at, Will? Raise your hand. Somewhere around here. Will? All right. Will was here. How would you bring accountability to the federal government? A pretty broad question, but what in particular? I mean, you've talked a little bit about it, but as commander-in-chief or as president, what are the immediate things you could do to say, hey, the new sheriff's in town?
I think the main thing we need to do is very, very simple. We should only spend what comes in. So $3 trillion comes in, that's what we should spend. Just have a rule. Every one of you have that rule. You can borrow a little bit against an asset that you have, but for the most part, your day-to-day expenses, you don't borrow money to pay for your grocery bill. You might borrow money for a house, but you don't borrow money to pay for your groceries. That's what we're doing. We're borrowing money to pay for our groceries. If you only spend what comes in, that's a restraint. But I can tell you, it's a mess up there. Most of them, you can't trust them because they've been up there for years and years, all spending money we don't have. And then some people will say, well, how can you provide for the military? How can you provide for our defense if we only spend what comes in? We bring in $3 trillion. I tell people, couldn't we just live on $3 trillion? And I think you prioritize it. There's a lot of stuff really they don't need to be doing in Washington. We do corporate welfare in Washington. Department of Commerce is passed out to rich companies. Top 250 companies get on average $200,000 or more from the federal government. Why would we be subsidizing big business? Why would we give $500 million loans to one of the richest guys in our country? That stuff should be cut out from the get-go, from day one, cut all of that out.
Tyler Gay, where are you at, Tyler? All right, we got around here somewhere. Or back here? Am I missing people? Okay. I should check behind as well. Can you elaborate on your tax cut plan and how this would help or affect veterans and their families?
Our tax code is 70,000 pages. People worry about jobs, American jobs going overseas, American companies going overseas. One of the reasons they go overseas is we're chasing them away with this Byzantine tax code. There are people who file. There's one company in America that files over a 50,000 page tax return and then doesn't pay any taxes. There are wealthy people who file thousands of pages of tax returns and don't pay taxes. Under my tax plan, everybody would pay 14.5% for business and 14.5% for personal. What it would do is all of a sudden everybody in the world would want to come here because we'd have the most attractive tax code in the world. So instead of us worrying about American jobs going overseas, people would be beating down the door to bring their companies here. Right now, we're losing dozens and dozens of big companies every year. Burger King reincorporated in Canada. We're losing several dozen to Europe. And we also have offshore $2 trillion of American profit that's earned around the world. They pay taxes overseas and then the money stays over there. I would encourage that to come home by lowering the rate. Right now we have the highest business tax in the world. Tell people I'm embarrassed to say that Canada has a lower tax rate than us. Canada's business tax is half of our business tax. Well, we're not going to survive as a country. You cannot survive. Money goes where it's welcome. So we need to make money and business welcome and encourage that money to come home. One other thing I would add to that, because in relating it to national defense, when people talk about the Cold War, we need to understand why we won the Cold War. Now, there are military reasons why we won the Cold War, and they do have to do with weapons and outcompeting the Russians. But ultimately, we won the Cold War because the engine of capitalism beat the engine of socialism. Our economic system provides great wealth. You can't buy all the stuff we need for national defense without great wealth. The Russians didn't have that wealth because their economic system was bad. The reason we need to know that and we need to appreciate it is if you don't appreciate capitalism, if you think, oh, well, we can just have a little socialism over here, ultimately you'll have no defense either because you cannot pay for a defense. And so when I say cut taxes like this and make them simple and flat and encourage, that creates more wealth, the economy booms, and it allows for you to provide for national defense.
Absolutely. Well, we've got, as you know, this guy's a busy man and he's got a flight to catch, so unfortunately we only have time for one more. And I think it piggybacks a little bit on what you just talked about. You mentioned that debt is the single greatest threat that we face today. Admiral Mike Mullen said it, General James Madison said it, others have said it, so it's not necessarily a new idea, but getting at that debt is a really difficult thing. You've talked a little bit about it. What, in addition to a tax code and DOD reform and things like that, what generally is it going to take to not just slow the growth, but actually start to chip away at $18 trillion in debt with the massive ramifications of what that number means?
You have to realize how easy mathematically and conceptually it is to do it. If you cut 1% from the budget this year and then do it again each year for 5 years, the budget balances in 5 years. Anybody here ever had to deal with a 1% pay cut or 1% less money? We all have. But the thing is, the government never does. The government does the opposite. When we have a slowdown in the economy, they spend more and we go farther into debt. So you can do it by cutting 1% a year. But then you say, will the people in Washington do it? Never. You got to bring them all home and you got to start over. And you probably need a rule. You probably need a rule, which would be an amendment to the Constitution saying that we can only spend what comes in. Because they try to police themselves and they'll have these new pay-as-you-go and all these restrictions. The sequester is one of those. And you'll hear this even among military communities. They'll say, oh, we have to get rid of the sequester. Now, the sequester is not a great way of doing it, but it means that top line, we slow down the rate of growth. And realize the sequester isn't a cut in spending over 10 years. It's a slowdown in the rate of growth. If you get rid of the sequester, which we've already gotten rid of most of it, to tell you the truth, we're going into more debt. And so you have to hold the line. And so what you have to do is if you say we're going to hold the line, but we're still going to provide for our veterans, then you have to just eliminate some things. You know, for example, there's stuff in the military department that we do. We spent $300,000, I think this was from the Department of Defense, studying the collective action of fish.
It could be dangerous fish, though.
Yeah, I think they were goldfish. And I said goldfish, and then one of the researchers said, oh, no, they're golden fish. We spent $300,000 on a television show that's produced by the military called Grill Sergeants. You know, I mean, the thing is, it might sound like fun, but if we don't have enough money for all of our veterans' needs, you got to cut the fluff out. You got to really go through, and that's why I've said even the Pentagon. So I know this is a largely veterans crowd. I'll tell you like it is. We should audit the Pentagon. We need to know where the money's spent. We got to get rid of the waste.
I think that's a fantastic way to end it. In fact, auditing the Pentagon has been one of our top priorities at Concerned Vets for America. You've always been an original co-sponsor of that legislation. Certainly makes sense to us. You got to know where the money is. I want to say a couple things. We didn't get every question answered, obviously. If you submitted a question, Senator Paul's staff said that they have them and they will get you an answer, so it doesn't have to go answerless. First of all, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank everyone seated with us out here in the audience for sharing time with us on this Monday afternoon. And then join me in thanking Senator Paul for a generous amount of his time. Thank you very much.